Dr. George Birnie of Victoria, Australia, was the son of a railway engineer. He enlisted in the Royal Army Medical Corps in 1914 after the Australian Army Medical Corps informed him that they had sufficient medical officers. He served with the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers before being sent to join the 8th Battalion, the East Surrey Regiment. The battalion missed the first phase of the Battle of Passchendaele, and for most of September 1917 it recuperated in the charming village of Zeggerscappel, where the men helped with the harvest, and Birnie developed a thriving general practice and brought several babies into the world, each new arrival being announced with the words "un autre soldat pour la France." This relative idyll ended on 23rd of September, when the battalion returned to the Ypres front to prepare for an attack on the German trenches east of Poelcapelle, a couple of miles from Passchendaele village, which began on 9th of October. The 8th East Surreys were ordered into the attack on 12th of October. What happened is seeringly described in Birnie's letter home of 26th of October from an English hospital. My dear mother and father, here I am once more in England, in peace and comfort, with a bullet hole through my neck. If it had been an inch closer in, I would now be lying out on the bloody Passchendaele Ridge, with many hundreds of our good fellows who went west on that day. But you see, it didn't. So let me try and give you an account of how 750 men went over the top, and less than 50 came back. We moved up in the afternoon, reaching at about 6 p.m. a point 5 miles from our line. Here every man was loaded up with extra bandoliers, bombs, picks, shovels, etc., till one wondered how they could get along at all. And then the long, weary march began. We were about 750 strong, and on account of the blackness of the night, marched in a long, continuous line in order to keep in touch. That march was hell, pure and simple. The guides lost their way. One can hardly wonder at it, through that trackless bog. This was through recently captured territory, and was simply a mass of shell holes and everlasting mud, raining most of the time, shelled at intervals, never going 20 steps without a halt, occasionally striking duckboards, but soon knee-deep in the mud again. The following morning I found the CO in a muddy shell hole, with a bit of galvanized iron on top to keep the rain off. There I found we were some 300 yards from Fritz, with him looking down on us. There was no possible place to set up a first aid post, but in our front line was a pillbox, and after consultations with the CO, decided that the only thing to do was to wait for half an hour after our barrage commenced, and then try to get through to this, and establish an aid post there. All day the rain came down. No one dared to show a head. About 4 a.m. we were subjected to a terrific strafing with 5.9 shells. God knows how we escaped. They landed as close as 10 yards off, showering mud and iron, but missed a direct hit. After dark, the various company commanders crawled in for the final conference. 0 hour, the time for going over, was 5:25 a.m., and perhaps you can easily imagine the suspense of the 2 or 3 preceding it. The ground was shaking from the heavy shelling. I cannot imagine how we did not get a direct hit on us. They could not have been closer. The din was terrific, and always the tap, tap, tap of the deadly machine guns and the soft whistle of the flying bullets. In the shell hole were the CO, the adjutant, and myself, and a signaller with a telephone at his ear. Now and then he would say, "The line is dissed, sir," disconnected, broken by shells. And out on the wire would go a signaller through the rain of shells and bullets to find and mend the break. During the last half hour, The strain became almost unendurable. I found myself shaking all over. They had gas-shelled us some time before, and the air was still thick with the heavy scent, but a wind had sprung up, and it was rapidly clearing. Only the CO sat absolutely calm and impassive, looking straight ahead of him, and always there was the shrieking rush and crash of the shells, and the increasing tap, tap, tap of the machine gun. And then, suddenly, our barrage opened. I have heard it now many times when in the line, and each time it seems more wonderful and awful. All through the night our shells had been few and far between. The Hun seemed to be doing just what he liked, and one had longed for the rush of our own shells, and now they were pouring over, thousands of them. You know those lines of Kipling's? Ubike means that warning grunt, the perished lines man knows, when o'er his strung and suffering front the shrapnel sprays his foes. And as their firing dies away, the husky whisper runs from lips that haven't drunk all day. The guns, thank God, the guns. It came into my mind as the din commenced, and such a din you cannot imagine. All the Hun batteries were opened in a minute. The whole air and earth was trembling. Tons of earth were being thrown into the air, whirlwind rushes and crashing explosions. It did not seem possible for anything to live. Remember, this attack was on a 5-mile front, and thousands of rifles and machine guns were adding to the row. And then, with a great cheer, our battalion rose out of the mud and went at the Hun. We saw them go only 200 yards away, the most terrible thing I have ever seen, for you could see them fall, see them blown high into the air, and still pressing on, taking cover where possible, and then a bayonet rush again. I waited for 3/4 of an hour nearby for the barrage to lift, and then it became obvious that we were being held up and were not advancing, and those cursed machine guns had not ceased. My stretcher bearers were with their companies, of course, and it had become imperative that I should get to the first aid post in the Pillbox, for I had sent round word that I would be there, and the only thing to do was to go. I took Sergeant Brown, Corporal Austin and Stevens, and a Red Cross flag. Just for 1 minute the most deadly fear got hold of me, the sort of thing that might almost paralyse you. Poor Franks was lying in the mud at my feet. It was a hellish trip. Poor Austin fell before we had gone 100 yards, shot through the heart. But somehow the rest of us got through, though the concussion of exploding shells nearly knocked us down again and again, and we were plastered with the mud they threw up. Our dead were lying in heaps. It was the worst slaughter I have ever seen. And here I may as well say that our barrage had opened behind the Hun machine guns, so missing them, so that our people were mown down. In a few minutes, nearly all officers and NCOs were knocked out, so that there was no one left to lead the men, and this was why we were held up. We got into the Pillbox, but as the entrance was too small, I decided to pull down an entrance that had been blocked up. The 3 of us did this, and I crawled out to find myself looking straight at 7 Huns, about 15 yards off in a shell hole with their rifles levelled. I felt a very weak feeling in the pit of my stomach, which was rather natural in the circumstances, don't you think? Goodness knows why they didn't shoot, but I grabbed a Red Cross flag and held it up, and then they lowered their rifles and waved me to go back. I could hardly believe my luck, for never have I known a Hun to respect the Red Cross. However, I had just fixed it over the new door, when one of our Lewis gun enthusiasts started off his gun from the other entrance. Well, you can't put up a Red Cross flag at one door and a Lewis gun at the other, so the only thing to do was to go out and bandage wounded wherever we could find them. I was very puzzled to know where my stretcher bearers were, and for a little, I regret to say, I thought they might be hiding in a shell hole. I feel ashamed when I think of that now, for soon I found the reason. They were all dead, all except 3. It was heartbreaking work. One could do so little and there was so much to do. Stevens and Sergeant Brown were simply splendid. We could not carry men away, but we dressed them. Sometimes we simply had to hide in shell holes, it got so very hot. And then in about 3/4 of an hour, a sniper bagged me. Something red hot shot through my neck, and I fell into a shell hole, I don't remember much more for a while, until I heard poor old Stephen say, "Are you dead, sir? Are you dead? God help those buggers if they've killed you." And then the more practical sergeant, who had sliced open my tunic, "It's all right, he ain't dead. Bit of blood about, but it's gone right through." It had gone through the lower part of the back of my neck, and was not a bad wound at all. But for a while all the nerve was knocked out of me, and I broke down and sobbed like a confounded baby. For every man seemed to be killed or wounded, officers, NCOs, and men. All the fellows I knew and liked, Pater, men I had been through other shows with. Dear old Belle Irving was missing. We had come through a bad gassing once together. Riddit was gone, the coolest man you ever saw in the line. Franks, Little Hearn, and many others. There seemed to be no one left, and I wished to God I had gone too. Luckily, I had a flask of whiskey, and a good pull at that worked wonders. But it must have been a good 2 hours before I could screw myself up to coming out and carrying on. But one can't stay in a shell hole with cries of "Water, for God's sake, water," going on all around. Do you remember a verse you gave us once when we were kids? It's not the fact that you're dead that counts, but only how did you die. It came into my head, though I haven't heard it for years. So we crawled out again and carried on all day. It was a most extraordinary experience, and as a result I have a respect for the Hun I never had before. Several times we found ourselves working in places surrounded by shell holes full of Huns, but none fired at us. Many pointed to where wounded were. Hun snipers pointed to where their victims were. It was most extraordinary. I've never experienced anything like it before. As the day wore on, none of our men could put up his head without getting a bullet through it, but no one shot at us. The shelling was the only thing to worry about, and sweeping machine gun fire. Only once were we shot at. Late in the morning, the firing suddenly redoubled, and for a time we had to take cover, in a shell hole. The reason was that the 53rd Brigade had been thrown in to support us. About 2 p.m. I went back to the HQ shell hole to report how things stood to the CO and had a rest for half an hour. I was awfully glad to see dear old Belle Irving again. He had been kept in a shell hole by a sniper, till someone had worked round and done him in. The sniper, I mean. After eating a piece of bread and a good stiff whiskey, I felt better, and went back with a message to any officers I could find. We worked carefully from shell hole to shell hole, but only 2 were left, and they were utterly worn out, and I counted only about 48 of our men unwounded. I could not bandage any more, for my arm had got stiff, but Stevens and Sergeant Brown carried on, and there were many hundreds lying about, Buffs, West Kents, Surreys, Berkshires, and a lot of Jocks in one corner I found. In nearly every case there were no stretcher bearers left, or MOs. All had been killed. It was heartbreaking work, for so many were dying. To those in great pain, and no chance of living, I gave enough morphia to put them out peacefully, and it was pitiful to hear their thanks with white faces twisted into a smile. "Thanks, Doc. I'm not afraid, but this damn pain gets you down." Or a message to someone at home they would never see again. At 4:30 I saw someone coming under a Red Cross flag, whom I looked for a long time, for I knew he would come, as soon as he got my message. It was Lister of 55th Field Ambulance, one of the best men in France. He has been out since the beginning. His right arm is useless as a result of wounds, and he has 2 bars to his military cross, but he won't stay at base, and is the only man I know who seems to enjoy shelling. This was the 3rd time he came to my help when I needed it badly, and heavens was I glad to see him. He brought up bearer squads, and though some were knocked out, there were plenty to start getting wounded away, and I came away then, for I was feeling very done. I reported to the CO, and somehow I hated leaving him, though of course I could do nothing, but he looked so utterly worn out. He is only 29, but his hair is almost white. Time and again he has brought the battalion to a pitch of perfection, only to be thrown into some desperate position again, and more or less wiped out. It is too much of a strain for any man, but that is the worst of war. A good man is tried to the limit, and so Stevens and I started on an apparently endless journey to a dressing station, and I have never been so utterly worn out in my life. The shelling was heavy at times too, but as Stevens said, there ain't no shell will touch us after what we've been through today. And that was exactly what one felt. Eventually, a motor car took us to the casualty clearing station. There I got into bed and got an orderly to see that Stevens was looked after. My wound is a nice in-and-out bullet wound and won't cause any trouble, and it is healing well. I am not very keen about going out again just yet, as my nerves are really pretty rotten, and I still have rather bad nights. When I go over all that awful show again and see all those fellows die and get wounded again every time. But it is passing off. A mail just arrived with a letter from the colonel. An aeroplane bomb had fallen the night before, right into the HQ mess. Dear old Bell Irving was killed, and Corporal Brown also. He was our cook. In many a dinner I have planned with him. Stevens is wounded, and the colonel's favourite horse was killed by another bomb. As he said, even she, the mare, makes another gap in our little company. Oh, I wish it would all finish. All the good fellows going, and the end not yet in sight. Poor old Bell Irving, the best-natured, kindest, cheeriest, and bravest fellow you could ever meet. And I would never have got through the gas that night but for him. Since the 12th, all the ridge we fought so hard for has been taken, but at a price.